Marcus Thompson sat in his first-class seat aboard Flight 2317, his fingers quietly tapping on his laptop as he reviewed the final details of his latest business acquisition. At 42, he had built his tech empire from scratch, turning a small startup into a $4.2 billion company. But today, dressed in comfortable jeans and a plain black sweater, he looked like any other passenger. Sarah Cooper, a senior flight attendant with 15 years of experience, had been watching him since he boarded. Something about his presence in first class bothered her, though she couldn't admit to herself what it was. She had grown up in a small town where diversity was merely a word in textbooks, and her prejudices, deeply rooted but carefully hidden, influenced her every interaction. The flight was headed from New York to San Francisco, and as the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus politely pressed the call button. He needed his laptop charger from the overhead compartment, having forgotten to grab it when he first settled in. A simple request that would set off an unexpected chain of events. Sarah approached his seat, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her tone carrying a slight edge that most passengers might miss, but Marcus had heard it too many times in his life to mistake it for anything else. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely. "Could you help me get my laptop bag from the overhead compartment? It's the black leather one." Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. "Sir, if you needed something from your bag, you should have taken it out before we took off. I'm not here to be your personal butler." The businessman sitting across the aisle looked up from his magazine, startled by her tone. Marcus remained calm, his voice steady. "I understand, but I simply need my charger. It will only take a moment." "Look," Sarah snapped, her voice rising slightly. "If you can afford a first-class ticket, you can surely handle your own bags. Or maybe you're not used to flying first class." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but years of dealing with prejudice had taught him patience. He stood up slowly, his impressive 6'2" frame making Sarah take a step back. "I'll get it myself then," he said quietly. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Marcus reached for the overhead compartment, Sarah, acting on what she would later claim was a security concern, grabbed his arm roughly. When he turned to face her, her hand swung out, connecting with his cheek in a sharp slap that echoed through the quiet cabin. The first-class cabin fell silent. Phones came out, recording the aftermath. Sarah stood there, her hand still raised, sudden realization dawning on her face. Marcus touched his cheek, his expression unreadable. I thought he was going to." Sarah stammered, but the words died in her throat as Marcus pulled out his phone. "James," he spoke into the phone, his voice deadly calm, "I need you to contact our legal team immediately." "Yes, I'm on Flight 2317. I've just been assaulted by a flight attendant. Yes, there are witnesses and videos. Also, get me the CEO of the airline on the line." The color drained from Sarah's face as Marcus continued, "And James, pull up everything we have on their pending corporate merger. Yes, the one where they need our technology integration to complete the deal." Other flight attendants had rushed to the scene, along with the flight purser. Marcus held up his hand as they approached. "I don't want to hear any excuses. What I want is for everyone to return to their seats, including Ms. Cooper here, and we'll handle this properly when we land. And yes," he added, looking directly at Sarah, "I know your name. I make it a point to know who provides service on my flights, especially in first class, where I fly roughly twice a week." Sarah stumbled back to the galley, her hands shaking. The other passengers watched as Marcus calmly sat back down, opened his laptop, and began typing. No one missed the fact that he was drafting an email to the airline's board of directors, whose contact information he apparently had at his fingertips. The next 2 minutes stretched like hours in the tense cabin. Sarah stood in the galley, clutching a tissue, realizing that her entire career, and perhaps her life as she knew it, had just imploded because of her own prejudices. She had no idea that those 2 minutes would change not just her life, but the entire airline's approach to diversity and inclusion. Marcus continued typing, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. The real story was just beginning. The next 2 hours of the flight were thick with tension. News of the incident had already spread throughout the aircraft, with passengers in economy class whispering and sharing videos they received from friends in first class. Sarah remained in the rear galley, her hands trembling as she watched other flight attendants serve her section. Marcus's phone hadn't stopped buzzing. James, his executive assistant, had already set things in motion. The airline's CEO, Richard Maxwell, was desperately trying to reach him, but Marcus let the calls go to voicemail. He knew the power of silence, especially in situations like this. In the cockpit, the pilots had been informed of the situation. Captain David Chen was already radioing ahead to San Francisco International Airport, knowing this wasn't going to be a normal landing. Airport police and airline representatives would be waiting at the gate. Mr. Thompson, a young flight attendant named Michael, approached cautiously. "I've been asked to inform you that the captain would like to speak with you." Marcus nodded and followed Michael to the cockpit. Inside, Captain Chen turned in his seat. "Mr. Thompson, I want to personally apologize for what happened. We've already contacted our ground team, and they're prepared to handle this situation as soon as we land." "Thank you, Captain," Marcus replied, his voice measured. "But this isn't about just me anymore. This is about every passenger who's ever been profiled or mistreated because of their race. Your airline has a systemic problem, and today it's going to be addressed." As Marcus returned to his seat, his phone displayed a new email. His legal team had already drafted a comprehensive action plan. They weren't just pushing for Sarah's termination. They were demanding a complete overhaul of the airline's training programs and hiring practices. In the galley, Sarah sat with her head in her hands. Her colleague, Rebecca, tried to comfort her. "Maybe if you apologize," she started, but Sarah cut her off. "You don't understand," Sarah whispered. "I saw his name on the manifest. Marcus Thompson. Marcus Thompson. He owns Thompson Tech Solutions. They're providing the entire digital infrastructure for our airline's merger next month. I didn't just slap a passenger. I slapped the man who holds our company's future in his hands." The reality of her actions was sinking in deeper with each passing minute. She had let her prejudices override not just her training and professionalism, but basic human decency. The weight of her mistake felt crushing. Meanwhile, Marcus opened his laptop again, this time pulling up the airline's diversity statistics that his team had quickly compiled. The numbers were telling. Less than 12% minority representation in senior crew positions, multiple unaddressed complaints about racial profiling, and a pattern of discriminatory incidents that had been quietly settled out of court. He began drafting a press statement, not as an angry victim, but as a businessman who understood the power of transforming a crisis into an opportunity for change. His company's involvement in the airline's merger gave him leverage, but he wasn't interested in revenge. He wanted reform. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, passengers were asked to stow their electronic devices. Before shutting down his laptop, Marcus sent one final email to his team. "Prepare the diversity training package we developed for our corporate clients. This airline is about to become our next case study in institutional change." Sarah watched from the galley as police officers boarded the plane immediately after landing. They took statements from witnesses while airline executives, who had rushed to the gate, waited anxiously in the jet bridge. The other passengers were held back as Marcus calmly gathered his belongings. As he stood to leave, he paused at the galley where Sarah stood. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the cabin was completely silent. Everyone expected anger, perhaps even satisfaction at her obvious distress. Instead, Marcus spoke quietly. "Miss Cooper, I hope you understand that what happens next isn't about punishment. It's about progress." With those words, he walked off the plane, leaving Sarah to face not just the consequences of her actions, but the reality of her own prejudices. Through the window, she could see camera flashes from the terminal news crews had already gathered. This wasn't going to be a story about a racist flight attendant who slapped a black billionaire. This was going to be a story about systemic change, whether the airline was ready for it or not. The real transformation was about to begin. Within hours of landing, the incident had exploded across social media. #FlightAttendantSlap was trending nationwide, with the video being shared millions of times. What happened next surprised everyone watching the story unfold. Inside a private conference room at San Francisco International Airport, Marcus sat across from airline CEO Richard Maxwell and a team of nervous executives. The room was tense, with papers spread across the glossy table and lawyers whispering in corners. "Mr. Thompson," Maxwell began, his voice strained, "we want to assure you that Ms. Cooper's employment has been terminated effective immediately. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation and... Marcus raised his hand, cutting him off. Mr. Maxwell, I'm not interested in money or a single firing. What happened today is a symptom of a much deeper problem. He opened his laptop and turned it toward the executives. These are the diversity statistics from your airline over the past decade. They tell a disturbing story. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Marcus continued. Your merger next month requires our company's technology integration to succeed. That deal was worth $50 million to my company. I'm willing to reduce that to $1 if you agree to invest the remaining $49 million into a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program. Meanwhile, in another room, Sarah Cooper sat with her union representative and two HR managers. Her face was streaked with tears as she watched the video of herself for the first time. The person she saw in that footage didn't align with who she thought she was. I don't know what came over me, she whispered, watching herself slap Marcus. I've never done anything like this before. One of the HR managers leaned forward. Ms. Cooper, we've reviewed your service record. While there have been no physical altercations, we found multiple complaints about differential treatment of minority passengers. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. Back in the conference room, Marcus was outlining his vision. I want a complete overhaul of your training programs. My company will provide the technology and resources. We'll develop virtual reality scenarios to help staff recognize and overcome unconscious bias. Every employee, from pilots to ground crew, will go through this training. Richard Maxwell loosened his tie, considering the offer. The negative publicity was already affecting their stock price, and they desperately needed the merger to succeed. And if we agree to this? Then I don't press charges against Ms. Cooper or the airline, Marcus replied. Instead, we turn this into a story of positive change. Your airline becomes an industry leader in diversity and inclusion. As discussions continued in the conference room, Sarah was being escorted out of the airport. Paparazzi swarmed around her, shoving questions. She covered her face, overwhelmed by the chaos she had created. Her phone was flooded with messages from friends and family who had seen the video. Some expressed shock, others disappointment, and a few even defended her actions. Those messages hurt the most, making her confront the uncomfortable reality of her social circle. By evening, Marcus's team had drafted a comprehensive reform proposal. It included mandatory bias training, revised hiring practices, and the creation of a passenger advocacy board. The airline executives, seeing no better way out of the crisis, agreed to all terms. As Marcus left the airport that night, his phone rang. It was his mother. I saw what happened, son, she said softly. Are you okay? I'm fine, Mom, he replied, looking out the car window at the city lights. Remember how you always told me to turn obstacles into opportunities? That's exactly what I did today. In her small apartment across town, Sarah sat alone on her couch, watching the news coverage. To her surprise, Marcus was giving a press conference, but he wasn't talking about her or the slap. Instead, he was announcing a groundbreaking partnership between his company and the airline to revolutionize diversity training in the aviation industry. Today's unfortunate incident, he told the reporters, has led to what I believe will be a transformative moment in commercial aviation. This isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about creating lasting change. Sarah turned off the TV and opened her laptop. With trembling fingers, she began typing a letter. Not just an apology, but a deep reflection on her actions and their consequences. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she knew she needed to take the first step toward her own transformation. As night fell over San Francisco, both Marcus and Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The story was far from over, and its ripple effects were just beginning to spread across the airline industry. The following morning, Marcus sat in his San Francisco office, reviewing the final details of the airline's transformation plan. Headlines across the country were telling a story that few had expected. Black billionaire turns racial incident into revolutionary change, and Thompson Tech to transform airline industry's approach to diversity. Sarah's letter had arrived in his email early that morning. His assistant had flagged it as important, though Marcus hadn't opened it yet. He was more focused on the task ahead, implementing real change that would affect thousands of airline employees and millions of passengers. Sir, his assistant James interrupted. The airline's board of directors is on line 1. They're concerned about the cost of implementing the new training programs. Marcus picked up the phone, his voice firm. Gentlemen, let me be clear. The cost of not implementing these changes will be far greater. Your merger deadline is approaching, and without our technology, you'll lose billions. This isn't a negotiation. Across town, Sarah was facing her own struggles. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from media outlets offering money for exclusive interviews. Her social media accounts have been flooded with messages, some expressing hatred, others offering support, and many from fellow flight attendants sharing similar stories of their own biased behavior. She sat in her local coffee shop, trying to avoid the stares of people who recognized her from the news. Her sister Rachel joined her, sliding into the seat across the table. Have you thought about what you're going to do next? Rachel asked gently. Sarah stared into her untouched coffee. I've been up all night thinking about it. I sent Mr. Thompson a letter this morning, not just apologizing, but, she paused, fighting back tears. I asked if I could be part of the solution. I want to help develop these new training programs. My experience, my mistake, could help others recognize their own biases before they act on them. Meanwhile, at Thompson Tech headquarters, Marcus finally opened Sarah's email. As he read, his expression remained neutral, but there was a thoughtful look in his eyes. The letter was different from what he expected. Instead of just apologies, Sarah had included a detailed analysis of her own background, upbringing, and the gradual development of her prejudices. She'd attached links to studies about unconscious bias and suggested ways her experience could be used as a teaching tool. Marcus pressed the intercom. James, get me Dr. Patel from our training development team. Within an hour, Dr. Patel sat across from Marcus, reviewing Sarah's letter. This is interesting, she said, adjusting her glasses. Her insights could be valuable in developing our simulation scenarios. The personal perspective of someone who's confronted their own bias. It's powerful. Marcus nodded slowly. Set up a meeting. But not here, somewhere neutral. And make sure our legal team is present. That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected call. Miss Cooper, this is James from Thompson Tech. Mr. Thompson has reviewed your letter and would like to arrange a meeting to discuss your proposal. The news spread quickly through the airline industry. Other carriers began reaching out to Thompson Tech, inquiring about similar training programs. Marcus's phone was ringing with calls from other CEOs, all suddenly eager to get ahead of potential incidents at their own companies. In his office that evening, Marcus called his mother again. Mom, remember when I told you about turning obstacles into opportunities? Well, it's happening on a bigger scale than I imagined. This incident might actually change the entire aviation industry. His mother's voice was proud but concerned. And what about the flight attendant? The one who... She trailed off. She might end up being the key to making this work, Marcus replied. Sometimes, Mom, the person who creates the problem has the best insight into solving it. As the sun set over San Francisco, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email confirming her meeting with Marcus and his team. Her hands were steady now, unlike the trembling fingers that had typed her letter that morning. She opened her laptop and began researching unconscious bias training, diversity initiatives, and airline industry statistics. If she was going to be part of the solution, she needed to understand the problem from every angle. The story was taking an unexpected turn, transforming from a tale of racism and revenge into something more complex. A journey of redemption, understanding, and systemic change. The real work was just beginning. 3 days after the incident, Sarah walked into a small conference room at a neutral location, a downtown hotel chosen by Thompson Tech's team. Her heart was pounding as she saw Marcus sitting at the table alongside Dr. Patel and 2 other professionals. The room was purposefully arranged to feel less intimidating, with natural light streaming through large windows. Miss Cooper, Marcus greeted her with a professional nod. Thank you for coming. This is Dr. Patel, our head of training development, Mr. Rodriguez from our legal team, and Dr. Williams, our diversity consultant. Sarah sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had prepared for this meeting all night, but facing Marcus in person was different from rehearsing in front of her mirror. The memory of her actions on the plane felt even more shameful in his presence. I've reviewed your proposal, Marcus began, opening a folder in front of him. Your suggestion about using your experience as a case study is interesting. But before we discuss that, I want to hear more about what you've learned since the incident. Sarah took a deep breath. The past few days have been transformative, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. I've been examining every interaction I've had during my 15 years as a flight attendant. Patterns I never wanted to acknowledge before. Assumptions I made without even realizing it. Dr. Patel leaned forward, clearly interested. Can you give us specific examples? As Sarah began sharing detailed instances from her career, times she'd given preferential treatment to certain passengers, times she'd made assumptions based on appearance. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The professional distance began to dissolve into genuine engagement. Meanwhile, across town at the airline's headquarters, executives were reviewing the first draft of Thomson Tech's new training program. The virtual reality simulations were unlike anything they'd seen before. Employees would experience scenarios from multiple perspectives, both as the person exhibiting bias and as the person experiencing it. Back in the hotel conference room, Marcus watched as Sarah walked them through her ideas for the training program. She had created a detailed outline of how her incident could be broken down into teachable moments: the subtle buildup of tension, the unconscious assumptions, the moment of crisis, and the aftermath. The key, she explained, pointing to her notes, is helping people recognize these patterns before they escalate. I never thought I was capable of what I did on that plane, but looking back, there were so many warning signs I ignored. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. This is exactly the kind of personal insight that makes training memorable. Theory is important, but real experiences resonate more deeply. As the meeting progressed, Marcus's phone buzzed with news alerts. Other airlines were already announcing their own diversity initiatives, trying to get ahead of similar incidents. The industry was changing faster than anyone had anticipated. Ms. Cooper, Marcus said finally, we're prepared to offer you a 6-month contract as a consultant for our training development team. You'll work directly with Dr. Patel to develop these scenarios. However, he paused, making sure she understood the gravity of his next words. This isn't absolution. This is an opportunity to turn your mistake into meaningful change. Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes. I understand, and I'm ready to do the work. As they wrapped up the meeting, Dr. Patel outlined the next steps. Sarah would begin work the following week, starting with detailed documentation of her experiences and helping to develop the virtual reality scenarios. Walking out of the hotel, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and determination. She had expected punishment, but instead received an opportunity for redemption through meaningful work. Marcus watched her leave from the conference room window. Dr. Williams stood beside him. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. Sometimes, Marcus replied, the most powerful advocates for change are those who've had to confront their own failings. She understands the problem from the inside out. That evening, news of Sarah's new role broke on social media. The reactions were mixed. Some praised the decision as innovative, others criticized it as too lenient. But Marcus knew that real change wasn't about punishment or public opinion. It was about transformation, both personal and systemic. As night fell over the city, both Marcus and Sarah sat in their respective homes, reviewing their notes from the meeting. Neither could have predicted this outcome when they boarded that flight, but sometimes the path to progress takes unexpected turns. The transformation was no longer just about one airline or one incident, it was becoming a movement. 1 month into the training program development, the impact of the incident was spreading far beyond the airline industry. Corporate America was watching closely as Thomson Tech's innovative approach to diversity training took shape. Sarah sat in her new workspace at Thomson Tech's training division, reviewing footage of her infamous Slack for what felt like the 100th time. But now, she was breaking it down frame by frame with a team of behavioral psychologists and training experts. Look at my body language here, she pointed to the screen. Even before the slap, you can see the tension building. The way I'm standing, my tone of voice, these are all warning signs we can teach people to recognize in themselves. Dr. Patel nodded, taking notes. The virtual reality program they were developing was revolutionary. Participants would experience scenarios from multiple perspectives, feeling the emotional impact of both conscious and unconscious bias. Meanwhile, Marcus was presenting the preliminary results to a group of airline CEOs in a downtown conference center. The room was packed. Every major carrier wanted to know more about the program that was being called the Thompson Method. Gentlemen, Marcus addressed the room, in just 1 month, our pilot program has shown a 47% increase in staff awareness of unconscious bias. But more importantly, we're seeing real behavioral changes. The statistics on the screen behind him told a compelling story. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped significantly at the original airline where the incident occurred. Employee satisfaction scores were up, and the company's stock had recovered from its initial plunge. Back at Thompson Tech, Sarah was leading a focus group of flight attendants, sharing her story and helping them identify their own biases. The session was being recorded for future training modules. I never thought I was racist, she explained to the group. I had black friends, celebrated diversity days at work, did all the right things on the surface, but deep down, I had these unconscious prejudices I never confronted until they exploded in the worst possible way. One flight attendant raised her hand. How do you deal with the shame? I've been watching myself more closely since your incident went viral, and I'm horrified at some of my own behaviors. Sarah's response was thoughtful. The shame is important. It shows you care. But it can't stop there. It has to motivate you to change. Across town, Marcus was wrapping up his presentation when a reporter asked the question everyone had been wondering about. Mr. Thompson, why did you choose to work with the very person who assaulted you? The room fell silent. Marcus smiled slightly before responding. Because Ms. Cooper represents something important, the possibility of change. She's not just a cautionary tale. She's proof that people can confront their biases and transform them into tools for positive change. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from a black passenger she had treated poorly 6 months before the slapping incident. The passenger had recognized her from the news and reached out. Watching your journey of accountability and change has helped me process some of my own anger. Thank you for not just apologizing, but for doing the real work of transformation. Sarah printed the email and pinned it to her office wall, next to the growing collection of notes and feedback from training participants. At his home office, Marcus was reviewing the latest program data when his mother called. I saw you on the news today, she said. Your father would have been so proud of how you handled this. Marcus looked at the photo on his desk, his father at the Civil Rights March decades ago. He always said change doesn't come from pushing people away, but from helping them see differently. The next morning, Thompson Tech's stock hit a new high as more companies signed up for the training program. What had started as a horrible incident was transforming into a movement for corporate change. Sarah arrived at work early, preparing for another day of training sessions. On her desk was a note from Marcus. 6 months ago, I saw anger in your eyes. Yesterday, I saw understanding. Keep going. She tucked the note into her journal, where she had been documenting her journey of transformation. The shame was still there, but it was now accompanied by purpose. The story that had begun with a slap was evolving into something much bigger, a testament to the power of turning pain into progress, prejudice into awareness, and mistakes into meaningful change. And they were just getting started. 6 months after the incident, Thompson Tech headquarters buzzed with excitement. Today was the official launch of the complete training program, now named Transform, Beyond Bias. Representatives from over 50 major corporations filled the auditorium, eager to see the final product that had been making headlines. Marcus stood backstage, reviewing his notes one last time. Next to him, Sarah adjusted her blazer nervously. This would be their first time presenting together in public, a moment that would have seemed impossible half a year ago. Are you ready? Marcus asked, noticing her tension. As ready as I'll ever be, Sarah replied. Though I never imagined I'd be standing here, about to address CEOs and corporate leaders about diversity and inclusion. The lights dimmed in the auditorium as Marcus walked onto the stage. 6 months ago, he began, an incident on a plane went viral. Many expected it to end with punishment and public shame. Instead, it became the catalyst for something revolutionary. The screen behind him displayed impressive statistics. Over 10,000 employees trained, customer satisfaction up by 35%, discrimination complaints down by 68%. But the most powerful moment came when he introduced Sarah. She walked onto the stage, her steps steady despite her racing heart. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Many had seen the viral video of her slapping Marcus. But what happened next surprised them all. "My name is Sarah Cooper," she began, "and 6 months ago, I was the face of everything wrong with corporate America's approach to diversity. Today, I stand before you as proof that transformation is possible, that only if we're willing to do the hard work." As Sarah shared her journey, the audience leaned forward in their seats. She wasn't just telling her story. She was revealing the hidden biases that existed in every workplace, the small moments that could build up to catastrophic events. The presentation of the virtual reality training program drew gasps of appreciation. Participants could experience scenarios from multiple perspectives, feeling the impact of both subtle and overt discrimination. Sarah's incident was included, but it was just one of many teaching moments woven into the program. During the demonstration, a CEO from a major retail chain volunteered to try the VR experience. As he went through the simulation, his reactions were projected on the screen. The audience watched as his expression changed from skepticism to understanding. "This is uncomfortable," he admitted after removing the headset. "But I recognize myself in some of these scenarios. We all need to face these uncomfortable truths." At the back of the auditorium, Dr. Patel smiled. The program was doing exactly what it was designed to do, making people uncomfortable enough to change, but safe enough to learn. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself surrounded by corporate leaders asking questions. One CEO approached her privately. "I had an incident in my company last month," he confided. "I was ready to fire the employee immediately. But after seeing this, maybe there's a better way." Meanwhile, Marcus was being interviewed by several major news outlets. "The goal was never just to create another diversity training program," he explained. "We wanted to transform how companies approach these issues. It's not about punishment, it's about progress." As the day wound down, Sarah and Marcus stood together at the podium for a final cue and a session. A reporter asked the question everyone had been wondering. "Mr. Thompson, Ms. Cooper, how do you work together now? Is there still tension?" Marcus looked at Sarah, then back at the audience. "The tension isn't between us anymore," he replied. "The tension is between who we were and who we're trying to become. And that's a tension we all need to face." After the event, Sarah found a quiet moment in her office. On her desk was a framed copy of her original apology email to Marcus, next to her new business card. "Sarah Cooper, Director of Transformation Initiatives." She touched the frame gently, remembering the fear and shame she felt writing that email. Now, those feelings had transformed into purpose and determination. As she packed up for the day, she received a text from her sister. "Just saw you on the news. You're changing lives, sis." Marcus, in his own office, was already receiving calls from companies wanting to implement the program. His assistant popped in with an update. "Sir, the waiting list is now 6 months long." He smiled, looking out at the setting sun. What had started as a moment of conflict had grown into a movement of change. And tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to transform lives. The story wasn't over. It was evolving into something bigger than either of them had imagined. 1 year to the day after the infamous slap, Marcus Thompson stood at the podium of the National Business Leadership Awards. The ballroom was filled with the country's top executives, all waiting to hear from the man who had transformed a moment of discrimination into a nationwide movement for change. "A year ago," Marcus began, "I sat in first class on a flight that would change not just my life, but the lives of thousands of others. Today, I'm proud to announce that Transform, Beyond Bias has been implemented in over 500 companies across America." In the audience, Sarah Cooper sat with the Thompson Tech team. She was no longer the frightened, prejudiced flight attendant from a year ago. Now, as the executive director of corporate transformation, she had helped train over 100,000 employees nationwide. The screen behind Marcus displayed the program's remarkable achievements. Workplace discrimination complaints down by 75% in participating companies, employee satisfaction up by 52%, and an unprecedented 89% success rate in changing workplace behaviors. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Marcus continued. The real success lies in the individual transformations we've witnessed. And speaking of transformations, he paused, looking toward Sarah. I'd like to invite my colleague to join me on stage. Sarah walked up confidently, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The audience, many of whom knew her story, broke into applause. She had become a symbol of what was possible when people were given the chance to learn and grow from their mistakes. A year ago, I was a viral video, a cautionary tale of what happens when unconscious bias turns into conscious action. Sarah addressed the crowd. Today, I stand before you as proof that change is possible, that transformation is real, and that our worst moments don't have to define us. In the back of the room, airline executives who had initially feared bankruptcy over the incident now sat proudly. Their company had become the industry leader in diversity and inclusion, with other airlines following their example. Marcus resumed speaking. Tomorrow, we're launching the next phase of our initiative. Transform. Beyond Bias is going global. We've partnered with airlines and corporations across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Because bias isn't just an American problem. It's a human challenge that requires a human solution. The announcement was met with a standing ovation. Among those standing was Marcus's mother, tears in her eyes as she watched her son continue the work of positive change that her generation had started. After the ceremony, at a small private gathering, Sarah approached Marcus with a gift, a framed copy of their first-class boarding passes from that fateful flight, along with a handwritten note. Sometimes the worst turbulence leads to the smoothest landing. Marcus smiled, accepting the frame. Did you ever imagine this is where we'd end up? Never, Sarah replied honestly. I thought my life was over that day. Instead, it was just beginning. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was from a major civil rights organization, announcing that both he and Sarah would be receiving their annual Leadership in Action Award. Your story, the organization's director explained, shows that real change doesn't come from punishment alone, but from giving people the tools and opportunity to transform themselves and their communities. Sarah, meanwhile, returned home to find her inbox flooded with emails from people sharing their own stories of transformation. One message particularly caught her eye. It was from a flight attendant who had almost made the same mistake she had. I was about to confront a passenger based on my own biases, but then I remembered your story. I stopped, checked myself, and changed my approach. Thank you for helping me become better. As the night drew to a close, Marcus sat in his office, looking at the framed boarding passes Sarah had given him. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Petel. Latest data shows we've reached 1 million training participants. We're really doing it. He smiled, remembering his father's words about change being a journey, not a destination. What had started as a moment of conflict had grown into a movement of transformation, touching lives far beyond that first-class cabin. Sarah, in her own home, opened her journal to write her final entry about the anniversary. At the top of the page, she wrote, 1 year ago, I was the problem. Today, I'm part of the solution. Tomorrow, we continue the work. The story that began with a slap had become a testament to the power of transformation, proving that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest changes. And this was just the beginning.